counsel across a range of disciplines, including media relations, employee awareness, incident response, hacker relations, disclosure incentives, social engagement, and public policy. She also serves as a public relations goon for DEF CON and Roots Asylum. She holds a Master of Science in Corporate Public Relations from Boston University, where she also taught courses on corporate communications. All right, she's here. She's hyped up on caffeine. And we had an extra 20 feet of mic cable installed during lunch because apparently she's a shark who can't be chained to the podium or she might die. And she talks fast even in high heels. I don't know. I read it on Twitter. It's got to be true. At any rate, please put your hands together for our next speaker, Melanie Ensign.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? It's been a long time since I've done karaoke, so this kind of mic setup is a little awkward. See, case in point. Awesome, thank you. So, per usual, BSides culture want to start off with a couple of caveats and disclosures for me. Obviously, nothing I say represents anyone I have ever worked for, including my employers or my clients. These are my own crazy ideas, so please don't hold them against anyone but myself. Also, I am not an engineer. My education background is in biological sciences and communications, but I have spent, I guess, the good part of a decade working specifically with security teams. So that is my background. That's where I'm coming from. And so I want to share with you guys just a little bit of insight and experience that I've had coming from the communication side in how we can help repair some of the reputational challenges of the security community. So I want to start with a couple of questions for you guys. Who is familiar with Title 18? Couple people? Really? Just a couple people? Yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Title 18 is part of a previous regulatory and legislation around computer security and data information security. It's unfortunately a lot of the reasons why people that I love and care about accidentally end up in jail for trying to do security research. How many of you believe that some of the current regulation and legislation, and a lot of it was discussed this morning, is actually going to help protect data security? Now, I don't mean protect consumers and keep companies from being like total like douchebags, but I mean actually going to help us secure things in a better way. Anybody? So this brings me to the impetus of why I'm here today. Our story sucks, you guys. It just does. In the public space, we kind of fall into two categories when it comes to security. We're either the super antisocial, totally inept engineering nerd, or we're the asshole who is bashing people on Twitter. And here's the problem with that, is our insecurities as a community are very, very loud. And that is what we're projecting to governments, what we're projecting to consumers. And so, for those of you who don't recognize this guy, Biff from Back to the Future, if you'll remember the way that the movie is set up, he starts as really kind of being that bully, right? He's got this rock star god complex, which of course nobody in Infosec has, right? And you know, he's picking on the little guy. And not only does he end up being like I can't even say glorified auto mechanic, but we're all rooting for him to fail, right? We don't want him to win. And this is our problem, is right now, this is the reputation of the security community outside of our culture, right? So if you go talk to the regulators, if you go talk to my mom, who is the epitome of a non-technical consumer audience, this is what they think of us, and nobody thinks that we can handle these challenges on our own, and nobody thinks that we either have the maturity or the skill set to secure consumers and the internet and technologies the way that we need to. And so what happens is people get scared. And when people get scared, the government steps in. We've heard a lot of people this morning already talk about how much money is in security these days, whether it's the government finding companies or individuals, or whether it's, vendors and others on the commercial side who are really feeding on this fear that we've allowed to take place within the public discourse. And they want us to fail, you guys. They don't think we can do it. And so I'm here to provide a couple of suggestions. Want to get the conversation started on what can we do, particularly as security researchers or as security engineers, to help shift that perception. Because if we don't take control of our message and of our story, this is how we're going to end up. So a couple of basics here. I mentioned a little bit kind of what people think of security, right? Versus what I know we actually are. The security community is incredibly imaginative. Everything that you guys do on a day-to-day basis is incredibly creative problem solving. People give you the impossible and expect you to find a solution. It's also incredibly nuanced. I bet there are probably no more than 4 people in this room who do the exact same thing in security. There are so many areas where you can be an expert, so many ways that you can contribute, and so many different skill sets. I mean, I'm here as living proof that there's a lot more than technical knowledge that is required for us to be successful in our goals. I want to talk about the creativity of the community as well. There are a lot of musicians, a lot of artists. That is a piece of our culture and our community that isn't really well represented when you think about what's in the news media or the way that a consumer would think about a security engineer. The security community is incredibly charitable, right? I mean, EFF is a good example of that. There are a lot of people here donating to a good cause simply because this is who we are and it's something that's important to us. I think about organizations like Hack for Kids or Roots Asylum, which takes place at the DEF CON conference every year. These are engineers and professionals who volunteer their time and their resources and their expertise to educate children in the next generation of hackers and security engineers. Again, that's a really underrepresented piece of who we are. And then I also think that security engineers are some of the most courageous people I've ever met. I have seen security professionals go head-to-head with attorneys and CEOs and journalists to stand up for what they believe in. That is not a piece of our story that people recognize and that people are responding to. Instead, they're thinking everything on, what is that, your right side? That's what they think of us. And because of that, our parents or the government, who's often doing the parenting for us, has to come in and constantly slap our hand, right? Nobody thinks that we actually have the capability to do the right thing. And I think that is absolute bullshit, and I think it's time that we actually take that back and show them who we really are. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. This is just a really small representation of everything that happens in the world of security. So you may fall into one of these areas, you may cross several of them, or you may just be a small segment of one of them. But often we get so laser focused on our own project or our own report or our own product, and we don't think about that the things that we say about security externally to people outside of our community ricochets and has an impact on all of those things. You as a researcher may say one thing to one reporter, which leads to a vendor coming up with a complete snake oil response to that, which is then going to force law enforcement to start looking for different types of behaviors and different patterns. I think it's also important to recognize that while we all have to work together, we don't always agree. So your policymakers and your law enforcement have a very different motivation and a very different agenda for participating in this conversation. So I hope, if nothing else, you guys walk away from this talk specifically with a little bit of a broader perspective of how are the things that you say and the way that you communicate impacting the success of the community at large, and how are your actions and your communication decisions going to influence how the others in our community respond. So this is one of my favorite places in the United States. Okay, someone has been there. This is the Beantown Pub in Boston. Full disclosure, I don't like nature unless it involves like sand and a cocktail. So this is really one of my favorite places in the country. One of the reasons why I love Beantown Pub so much is because if you go to this bar, you can order a cold, locally brewed Sam Adams. You can buy a Sam Adams Club sandwich. And if you sit near the window, you can actually enjoy your very tasty meal while looking at Sam Adams' grave across the street in the cemetery. That's always been a really cool experience for me, particularly because I think of Sam Adams as, I guess I would call him the chief communications officer of the American Revolution. Think about what he had to accomplish with those 13 disparate colonies, half of which endorsed slavery. And think about the branding and the communications required to achieve his goal, which was American independence. Now, you can argue for either side on who was the good guy or the bad guy in that dispute, but you can't argue that Samuel Adams was incredibly effective as a communicator in bringing that community together and moving forward to achieve a shared goal. Now, a couple of the things that made Sam Adams successful was that he understood some of the basics of public opinion. So I'm going to share with you guys just a couple of basic things that we're taught as professional communicators, so you guys can kind of have the same level set as we go through the rest of the content. So first, culture sets the tone, right? And not our culture, their culture. So when you think about communicating with regulators, when you think about communicating with your business leaders, when you think about communicating with consumers, it's their culture, right? They're going to approach whatever you say, and they're going to interpret your words through their perspective. So think about if you're trying to get a proposal approved, or if you're trying to make a point, if you're trying to shift the conversation in public discourse, it's about what they believe first, and then what we believe. So how do we look through their lens and communicate what we think is important? I think it was Lisa this morning who brought up the cyber dispute, right? So if the people you're trying to reach call it cybersecurity, fucking call it cybersecurity, right? It doesn't really, it's their culture that sets the tone. Secondly, samples represent the whole. And this is why I'm so concerned right now with where we've gotten as a community. Because you know who's really loud in our community? Our insecurities. Our insecurities are so loud. It's, you know, literally, I don't know what it is about Infosec that we just have this attraction for assholes, but they're really loud, and that's who people think we are. And that's not who we are, right? I mean, think about the list of those incredibly positive contributions that we bring to society that people don't recognize because our community representatives are not living up to the standard that we should be holding them to. People love a show. I'm always reminding my clients that the same crowd that cheers for your coronation is the same crowd that's going to cheer when you get beheaded, right? The drama sells. And so right now there's a lot of really negative drama that's being sold, insecurity from a communications perspective. We have an opportunity to change that. You know, is there a positive way that we can leverage that element of human nature to communicate a more positive reputation for ourselves? And lastly, stimuli can be substituted. So think back to Samuel Adams. He was able to capture the attention of the colonists on something that they shared And I think about some of the big events that he facilitated and quite honestly manufactured. I mean, we all know that the Boston Tea Party, not in, impromptu event that took place. That was specifically manufactured and facilitated to make a point and to capture people's attention. And through that event, he then just kind of flipped a switch and got people thinking about, it's no longer about taxation without representation, but it's now about our independence, right? He took it up a level because he had already captured people, brought them in, and then he just flipped that switch, and so now it was about a larger issue. So I want to talk a little bit about what connects people to those broader issues. This diagram here on the left-hand side, you'll notice, so I've labeled it distance, but it could mean a couple of things. The distance you are from the issue, but also the distance you are from the technical knowledge. So most of the people in the room, I'm assuming, would be here. You're really close to the security issue. You have a lot of intellectual knowledge and expertise. But think about, this is really the volume of people that we're reaching with that message. The further away you get from the issue and the further away you get from the technical expertise, it becomes an emotional conversation. Right now, this is being used really well by news media and by government in terms of the fear tactics and the scary stories that are being sold. We need to flip this on its head because you'll notice that the further you get towards an emotional argument, the more people you're impacting. So if our goal is to reach this many people, our technical jargon is not going to get us there. The way that we communicate with a mass audience needs to significantly shift into the emotional space. And I want to talk a little bit about outcomes. I have a couple of examples that I'm going to put up on the screen, which are my personal outcomes, reasons why I do what I do, just because I want you guys to see an example of what I actually mean by an outcome. Legal protection for security research, I mentioned this at the beginning, it's something that's incredibly important to me. Security as a digital literacy, I think it's incredibly important that we take basic internet and data security and make it a consumer available skill set, right? Like when you got up this morning, you locked your door on the way out of your house. Why do you do that? That's a cultural norm. Internet security and data security is not yet a cultural norm for us, and that's something that I'm working towards. And then lastly, the de-glorification of criminal activity. It drives me insane when I see stories in the news media that portray the criminal act involved in some forms of hacking or cyber attacks as somehow being the coolest of the two options, right? Like all the smart people are on the attack side. Actually, it's a lot harder to do the defense. And we don't do a good enough job of communicating that to people outside of our community. And we kind of let that perpetuation of the glorification of criminals, we let that grow and we let that fester. And that is one of the reasons why government and consumers have this perception in their mind that those of us on the defense side haven't quite figured out what to do. And so we obviously need a longer list of rules and boxes to check because we, you know, the criminals have the coolest tools. I will specifically call out what is not up here, which may be shocking for those of you who know some other professional communicators, or as I like to call them, PR bunnies. But media coverage is not up here. That is not an outcome. It is not a goal. It is a tool. It is a channel. It is a means to an end. Getting quoted in an article is not an accomplishment unless that article pushes the industry forward. So when you guys do engage with media and when you do other forms of public communication, I want you to think about what is your real outcome, right? One story, one article, not the goal here, but how can we leverage those opportunities to push the industry forward and take one step towards our real outcomes? Now I want to move a little bit into something different. So Walter Lippmann is somebody that I'm intimately familiar with. Anyone who, I know there's a couple of people in here with communications degrees, probably know who Walter is. We had to learn about him in school. He's considered the father of public opinion, and he kind of wrote their dissertation on this subject back in 1921. And many of the things that he wrote about are still very accurate and hold true today. And I want to share with you an excerpt from that book, because recently I've been seeing a lot of comments and a lot of complaints from the security community, specifically about news media, right? Like, they're always fucking it up. They can't get it right. Why are they writing like all these FUD articles? And I want you guys, the reason I'm here is because I want you guys to understand the space that we're operating in. And I want you to understand the realities of this environment so that we can learn how to communicate successfully. There are simply things about human nature and interpersonal communication that we can't change. And so when I read this to you, I want you to think, does this sound familiar to anything that we've heard recently, nearly 100 years later? So it is because they are compelled to act without a reliable picture of the world that government, schools, newspapers, and churches make such small headway against the more obvious failings of democracy, against violent prejudice, apathy, preferences for the curious trivial, as against the dull important and the hunger for sideshows and three-legged calves. Does this remind you of news media at all today? Guys, this is reality. This is 100 years later. It's not changing. And I'll get into some more specific things about media later on. But I want you guys to really be mindful of the fact that when you complain about reporters, they don't get better. We just look like idiots because we haven't figured out how to work within that space. So now I want to take you through an exercise that I do with a lot of clients called Start, Stop, Continue. I want you guys, these are suggestions and recommendations from me. You may disagree, and that's totally okay. But things that we should start doing as a community, things that we should absolutely stop doing, and things that we should continue doing that I actually think are helping us. So first is considering the bigger picture, right? I see lots and lots of articles with a researcher or a product manager, and it's obvious that they're making comments with a very, very small view of the world that we're operating in, and probably aren't considering that their words are going to impact the way that that journalist or that policymaker is going to approach the next researcher or the next security story. Collaborating with other disciplines, I think, is something that we desperately need help with. It's one of the reasons why I'm here. It's one of the reasons that I have a job. Because whether it's, the CEO or a journalist or a consumer or an advocacy group, there's a lot of translating that needs to be done between disciplines. And in particular, I think the comms discipline, we need to do a better job of roping them in, whether it's your PR team or your marketing team. They could be your best advocate, or they can be the biggest pain in your ass. And the way that we approach them and the way that we communicate with them makes a big difference on how successful and how accurate they are in their communications, and they can also be a resource for you. Opposing bad research and reports. Literally one of my biggest pet peeves. I hate the fact that the media will write every single goddamn flippin' report that somebody puts out in a press release. But that's the reality of it. They're going to do that. The news media feed on those numbers and those statistics, no matter how shitty the methodology is. Yeah?
I'm a reporter, and part of my job is figuring out what kind of bullshit security firms put out. They put out a lot.
Yep.
And most reporters can't tell the difference. Even like the New York Times has people who write for it, can't tell the difference from bullshit and reality. But I'm not going to attack those people because it's really, really difficult.
Yep.
And when you start throwing security terms around to a security reporter, you can stop them bullshit so easily. So you can't completely blame the media for this.
No, I agree. And in fact, I think this is one of the reasons why we as a security community are responsible, because we're feeding that to them. And that's what government reads. That's what my mom reads. If we're in this position, it's because we did it to ourselves. We are our own worst enemy when it comes to research and reports. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to collaborate with PR and marketing. Do go tell your marketing team that the thing they're about to put out is total bullshit. Help them understand why it's going to create more risk for the industry, why it's perhaps going to create more risk for your organization particularly. I think that's a really good point, that it is difficult for people without the technical knowledge to decipher between what's bullshit and what's not. And also, particularly with media, they often don't have the time to look under the hood and just kind of, scan what, the ins and outs of all the methodology that's being done. But I think it's really important that we take ownership of that, and that we make sure that the reports and the numbers and everything that's going out representing our community is real and is helpful. Selecting the right media opportunities, right? So this is something that your PR team will never tell you, but I'll tell you because I care about you. It's okay to say no to interviews. It's okay to not be part of a story if it's not the right story. And it's actually a lot harder to stay out of the news than to get into it. So, when you have the opportunity to engage with media, just ask yourself, is this the right kind of story for me, for my organization, and for the community? And then prioritizing the consumer audience. So somebody had a really good question in one of the earlier talks about how it's not just government that we're trying to reach, but also the consumers. If we really want this to become part of our culture, and if we really want this skill set to be something that somebody like my mom can understand and easily adopt, we have to think about communicating to a consumer audience. And again, if you'll remember the chart that I showed you earlier, the further away we get from the technical knowledge and the technical experience, the more emotional those stories are going to become and need to become if we're actually going to pull people into it. Think about the John Oliver interview with Edward Snowden. Nobody gave two shits about the NSA until we started talking about dick pics, right? That's literally, when I talk about the consumer audience, that's where we have to get to, right? They're never going to become security engineers, and we should stop expecting them to. We've got to put ourselves in their shoes and think, what is our outcome, right? What's the behavior? What's the, 5 years from now, what do we want consumers to be doing? Maybe 12 months from now, what do we want them to be doing? And they're not going to get there with what we've been throwing at them thus far. In terms of things to stop doing, I really had to limit myself with this list, so I've prioritized the most important things. This slide could have also been called, How Not to Be an Asshole 101. Stop hyping all the, seriously, you guys, this hurts us. It may be really cool, and you may be really excited to call your mom and tell her that you're, stopping cyber warfare, but that's not helpful. I put up Robert E. Lee here. If you haven't read his paper on the dangers and the negative outcomes of hyping security, I highly recommend it. But hype is really just detrimental to everybody. It makes it hard for us to pass accurate and proper legislation and policy. It makes it really difficult for consumers to want to be part of this. I'll tell you, every time a consumer gets scared of something, they go like this. They strong arm us. Ambulance chasing. I take it back. If this is the one thing you walk away with from this talk, it's this. Ambulance chasing is where, and I see lots of vendors do this, when somebody has a data breach, they're quick to jump in and point their fingers and have a comment. But I want you to remember that karma is a bitch. And if you're pointing fingers at somebody else, we all live in glass houses, right? I also think it's important that we keep in mind that in the business of security, our most valuable asset is our customer trust. I've seen companies lose really big deals and lose really important customers because their CEO does not believe that you can keep a secret. We are in the business of secrets. If you're throwing other companies under the bus, who's going to trust you? And then attacking each other. I see this a lot on social media. I wish I saw it less. But the example that I want to share with you guys is, you remember Superfish? And I saw so many people calling for the removal of the entire Lenovo security team, right? Because nobody in this room has ever lost a battle with their product team. Nobody in this room has ever been told to go shove it by the attorneys. I mean, really, you guys, like, those who are the loudest against other people, or remember that picture of Biff? Dude, man, we're selling tickets like for your breach and your issue. Because the louder you are against other people, the more we're going to enjoy watching you fall. Remember, people love a show. And then don't rely on the media to educate the public. Like, that's just lazy, you guys. It's not the reporter's job to translate very technical and very nuanced ideas to your target audience. Now, do they have some responsibility in reporting accurately? Yes. But all they have to work with is what we provide them, or what they can find. So think about, for example, if we're going to go with the consumer audience, do you have to go through the media? Do you have to go through those extra steps and those potential filtering systems? It's 2015. Lots of communication tools. It is not the media's job to do this for us. And then in terms of things that I actually think we're doing really well and I think are being helpful, learning the culture and language of business. This is incredibly important. We've heard a lot of people already today talking about understanding the needs and the priorities of regulators and business leaders. They're not ever going to invest in security or give security the importance that it needs for the same reasons that we are. And that's okay. But we need to learn how to communicate with them in their language and in their culture so that the things that we believe in and the things that we know to be the right things are actually being invested and executed. Engaging through social media, sometimes we're great at this, sometimes we're not. But I do really love to see the level of engagement that the community has had, particularly on Twitter, in terms of generating conversation and debate around the issues that really matter. It's also unfortunate that I see a lot of researchers or a lot of engineers, when they're misrepresented in the media, then start attacking a journalist on Twitter, which is also not cool. It makes the rest of us look bad. There are more appropriate, more professional, more respectful ways to communicate your disagreement or to help a reporter get it right than just attacking people on social media. But keep educating journalists. Some journalists are going to take the time to learn this really well. I would say over the last 12 months, I've seen a handful of reporters really gravitate to this as a real thing that they're willing to dedicate themselves to. And they've put in the time and they've done their homework. And you guys probably are thinking of the same people I am because we see them doing the right things consistently over and over again. But there are going to be those reporters who, are responsible for your local 6 o'clock broadcast who simply don't have the time, nor do they have the energy or the desire to get really good at this. And so it's up to us to help educate them as quickly and as simply as we can so that the important message is getting out to the public. And then continue supporting the community. When I first got into this nearly 10 years ago, somebody told me, once you get into security, you're never going to get out. That it just is this family and this community that you get sucked into, and that's absolutely true. And I think that is one of our greatest assets in terms of supporting each other. I also think it's one of our greatest challenges because we put up a lot of barriers between ourselves and those outside our community, and that isolation makes it really difficult for us to communicate effectively. And so then, of course, I want to just leave you guys with a couple of tips for working with media. there's a lot of talks and a lot of conversation coming from incredibly smart experts on this already, so I'm going to try to build on things that you may have heard in the past rather than duplicate them. But seek respect, not attention. I mentioned looking for the right media opportunities. It's really more important that our community has respect than that we get more attention. We have more attention than we know what to do with right now, and most of it is bad. You are a resource. You're not the story. Don't take it personally if the reporter does not write that you're like the fucking rock star of Infosec. And off the record is a myth, and I know that a lot of people bring this up in regards to the fact that anything you say is fair game. But I want to mention something else that's really important to keep in mind is off the record isn't a myth not solely because of what shows up in print, but because of what doesn't show up in print. Every engagement you have with a journalist impacts and influences the way that they think about our community and the way that they're going to interact with the next, security professional or researcher based on what you said. So it doesn't really matter if it shows up in print or not. You have forever changed that relationship because of the discussion and the conversation that you have. Journalists are really busy. A good journalist is working on at least 10 stories at a time. And they don't understand security, most of them. And that's okay. Stop hating them for not understanding security. We need to do a better job of educating those who are interested. And for those who aren't prioritizing security in their reporting, we need to do a better job of removing the jargon, removing the technical language, and if it's for the 6 o'clock news, give them 3 fucking bullet points that my mom can understand. And a lot of them care mostly about the crime, right? So there's a lot of comments, a lot of complaints about, how reporters are not covering the solutions or the answers. Well, you know what? Sunshine and Rainbows doesn't sell very well. And so just keep in mind, again, when we talk about selecting the right media opportunities, a lot of security reporters are actually like crime investigative reporters. They're never going to tell that story that you want them to. Don't hold it against them. That is their job, and maybe this just isn't the right conversation for you to be part of. So, hacker or criminal, we get to decide. This is time for us to take back control, to be really thoughtful and strategic in the way that we communicate and the words that we use to represent our community. So I will put it back on you guys in terms of, this is a start to a conversation. Where do we go from here? I think there's more conversation for us to have as a community, and I think that there are more opportunities for us to decide what those outcomes need to be. I shared some of my personal outcomes, but we as a community need to start deciding who we're going to be. So, any questions? Yeah?
So, you were saying that, media is just one channel and that maybe, owned is a better way of disseminating messages, especially, bringing the technical jargon down to, mainstream. Are there some channels that you find are most successful in reaching that audience?
Sure, so I think a lot of it depends on the specific audience, but I think, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, media is just one tactic, one channel, one means to an end. What are some of the other channels and tactics that are particularly effective in reaching an audience? And so I think if it's a consumer audience, I think there are companies who do a really good job with their blog. I think social media is a really good channel. I think it's about taking your message where your audience already is. And so this is a critical piece of what we do as professional communicators, is identify where that audience already is, because we can't have the expectation that they're going to come to us. So social media is one, blogging is one. I think there's a lot of really great in-person community interaction. A lot of security researchers and engineers who are going and doing things in their local community. So I mean, those are just a couple, but I think the real question is, who are you trying to reach, and where are they already located so that you can bring your message to them? Yeah.
How do we find assholery in our own community without resorting to flame war?
Do you want me to send you a list of just like Twitter handles? So the question was, how do we find that assholery in our own community? Oh, fight it. Oh. I was like, oh, I already got a list. I think part of it, is, the best, response to a fool is silence, right? So the public kind of shaming of that, I think, is just going to perpetuate the problem. I think where we really need to do a better job is giving voice to those other ideas and those other personalities in our community. We don't have to rely. There really is no solution for an asshole, right? They just are that way. But there's a lot of people in our community who are wonderful people and contributing significantly to the betterment of security, and they need a voice. They need a louder platform. And so that would be my best advice, is making the good stuff louder than the bad stuff. Yeah.
So to your point about, said many different ways, and it leads, rainbows and sunshine don't sell. Assholes sell, right? So loudmouth, pain in the asses are who the journalists generally gravitate to because they're already willing to speak publicly about silliness.
Right.
So how do you promote the rainbows and sunshine over the loudspeaker of assholes?
Yep. So a lot of this goes back to, I made the point about not relying on the media to do our job for us. There's no reason why we have to be dependent on a journalist to tell our story when we can go to DC and do it. Just get in the room with those people. And I think part of it, there's a lot of things about security that will sell, that we're not doing a good enough job of. Whether it's that typical good versus evil narrative, or, the David and Goliath story, or, the contributions that our community is making to the next generation and the investment that we're putting into children, I think is incredibly important and has a really strong human interest angle to it. So there are ways that we could do a better job with media, but I think the answer is not waiting for them to catch up to us, right? Go around them. There's no reason why, we have to cross our fingers and hope that some editor or some journalist is going to, say what we want to say when we can just say it ourselves.
I was going to, when you mentioned blogs, some security firms have really good blogs that explain things really well in plain English.
Mm-hmm.
Things
Yes.
Sophos does a good job of that. Kaspersky does a pretty good job sometimes. Look at them and follow what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the comment was that there are some security vendors and security researchers who have really good blogs, who do a really good job of breaking down some of those more complex ideas and communicating it in easy to understand language. And the media do pick up on that. It makes their job a whole lot easier. Like I said, reporters are really busy. If you can make this easier for them, do the heavy lifting for them, that can go a long way. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Alan.
So, going back to the discussion earlier about bad reports and FUD, while we shouldn't go after the reporter, are there things we can do as a community to sort of keep each other honest, or do you think naming and shaming is the wrong solution when someone's saying implicates the nation state based on a qualification?
Yeah, so So I will actually say, and I'm going to have a lot of I'm putting a target on my back right now. But I think the best way that we can impact that problem is going after our own PR and marketing teams. I don't know a researcher who puts out those types of reports all by themselves. It's usually in the form of a press release through, some PR team. So go after them. That would be my recommendation. I think they're one of the biggest obstacles we have are uninformed communicators. So just like I'm here now giving you guys a little bit of communications insight, I talk to the communicators giving them security insight because they don't understand that by going out with some of these numbers and some of these reports, which journalists can't tell are bullshit, actually makes it really difficult for us to be successful in actually securing things, right? This is why media coverage is not an outcome. sometimes it's a problem, sometimes it's a tool. But we as a community need to decide what our goals are, what the results are, and what the outcomes are that we're striving towards, and make those, whenever you have to make a communication decision, keep those outcomes in mind, because that's where we want to move. More media coverage isn't going to help us if it's the wrong type of coverage. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said one of your goals was to de-glorify the criminal side of the equation. And
Yeah.
how do you go about doing that? Because sort of that's the criminal side of the story is, let's eat popcorn while we watch Sony go down in flames. And the successful defensive side is nothing happened today. So how do you even start on that?
So I think one of the things that we haven't done really well is the defense side is like fucking interesting, you guys. Like, you're in this career because it's fun and it's interesting, right? And it means something. Why isn't that story out there? Why aren't we doing a better job telling that story? And I think sometimes it's because those of you who hold the keys to some of our most interesting stories maybe don't have the communication tools to get it out there. And that's why collaboration with other disciplines is so important, because we can help do that, right? Those of us who have been professionally trained to do this kind of stuff actually need people like you, because you're a really cool story that nobody knows about yet. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to throw a comment in. I'm a journalist. I've been covering security for about 7 years now. Sunshine and rainbows don't sell, but good news comes around very, very infrequently. Do you think there's more room for better communication training amongst people, get those good stories out? Like EFF, I've covered a lot. I've covered a lot of botnet takedowns. I've covered a lot of collaboration work. Doesn't get the biggest hits, but I think it's really positive for the industry. How can you get those better stories out? Because people do click on malware.
Yeah, and I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but I really think education of the communications professionals is critical, because they're selling fear because it's easier. And because that's what's kind of falling out of the sky for them, right? So fear and scary things sell not just in media, but for your marketing team and for your sales team. So think about, what are we arming them with when they represent our community, when they're talking to a journalist or, to an audience such as this? Do they have in their back pocket those positive stories that are like, yeah, so there are people trying to attack us, and we've got a kick-ass, badass security team doing all this shit over here, like, that's actually helping. I think sometimes the communications community can actually make it more difficult for you guys, so I'm not here to apologize for them. They know how I feel about that. But, if you guys could help teach us, that would be super, super helpful.
I think it would also be really cool workshops, maybe communications people to work on, like BSides workshops, you, and really cool up some people actually could help people know how to reach out to a journalist, because I'm on Twitter trying to reach people and people don't respond sometimes. It's like, screw you, I'll call someone else.
Yeah.
Who might be all these fun merchants, but they can respond.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that's all.
It's a good point. Are there any other questions? I know we just have a couple minutes. Yeah.
Just a quick one. You mentioned something about the community that really appealed to me, and I think
Was it the Biff photo?
part of what I see in the community is that we seem to accept making the same mistakes over and over, particularly in the AppSec side. Maybe within the community we can just do better at not making the same mistakes over and over.
Yeah, I agree. There seems to be kind of that lack of body of knowledge that maybe exists in other scientific fields, where there's, here's the body of knowledge. I mean, I'm opening a huge can of worms because it goes into education and information sharing and all of that. But I think to your point, there are opportunities for us to learn from mistakes so we don't repeat them. And part of that, it's one of the reasons why events like this are so important, because this is, I think, a pillar of how we share ideas and information with the community and how we share what we've learned so that we don't repeat those mistakes. Anything else? Haha. So my Twitter handle is @iMelanie, and it's IMELUNY. It's also on the slide, but I guess it's really small. It's not like I get paid to do stuff like this. I don't know why I would make it readable. All right, thanks so much, you guys. You've been great.
All right, folks, thank you. That was Melanie Ensign. Please join us after the break. Next, we've got coming up Jesse Irwin talking about